The boy had been standing outside the funeral home for 11 minutes before he worked up the courage to approach the tallest, coldest-looking man in the crowd. Damian Cross did not attend funerals. He had not stood inside a church in 6 years, not since the last time a priest had said words over a casket that mattered to him. He was only here today because the man in the ground had once run numbers for his father, decades ago, and certain debts of respect outlived the men who earned them. He was standing apart from the mourners, near the black iron fence at the edge of the cemetery, when a small hand tugged twice at his sleeve. "Mister," the boy said, "can you pretend you're hugging me? Just for a minute. Please." Damian looked down. The boy was maybe 8 years old, thin in the way that spoke of skipped meals rather than childhood build. Wearing a jacket 2 sizes too large with a sleeve torn at the cuff. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry, the particular dry of a child who had already used up every tear he had. "Why?" Damian said. It was not unkind. It was simply the only word that came. The boy's gaze flicked past Damian's shoulder, toward the cemetery gate, where a black sedan idled with its engine running and 2 men in dark coats stood watching the crowd with the flat, patient attention of men who were not here to mourn anyone. "Because if they think I'm with somebody important," the boy whispered, "maybe they won't take me today." Damian did not know this child. He did not know the men by the gate, though something in the set of their shoulders, the careful way they scanned the mourners without once looking at the casket, told him instantly that they were not grieving anyone either. They were working. He crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, close enough now to see the fading yellow-green bruise along his jaw, 3 days old at least, and the way the boy's hands trembled even as he tried to hold them still. "What's your name?" Damian said quietly. "Ben," the boy said. "Benjamin Ortiz." "Ben." Damian kept his voice low, steady, the same tone he used to calm men twice this boy's age in rooms far more dangerous than a cemetery. "Who are those men?" Ben's throat worked once before he answered. "They work for the man my aunt owes money to. She said if she doesn't pay by tonight, they're going to take me instead. To make her pay faster." His voice cracked on the last word, though his eyes stayed dry. "My aunt's inside. She's crying too hard to notice I'm not standing with her." Something in Damian's chest, sealed shut for longer than this boy had been alive, moved for the first time in years. He put his arm around Ben's thin shoulders, and the boy pressed into the embrace with the desperate, practiced stillness of someone performing safety rather than feeling it, a child who had learned, recently and thoroughly, that looking cared for was sometimes the only protection available. "Stay close to me," Damian said quietly. "Whatever happens in the next 5 minutes, don't let go of my hand." He did not tell Ben, holding him there at the edge of a stranger's funeral, that the 2 men by the gate worked for a lone operation Damian's own organization had been quietly investigating for months, a network that had, in the last year, grown considerably more violent than the ordinary business of collecting debts required. He did not tell him that the name on the file back at Ravenwood, the name behind that lone operation, belonged to a man Damian had crossed paths with exactly once before, 17 years ago, in circumstances that had nothing to do with debts and everything to do with a debt of his own that had never been paid. He simply held the boy a little tighter, watched the 2 men by the gate begin walking toward the crowd with the unhurried confidence of men who believed nobody in this cemetery would dare stop them, and understood with a cold and sudden clarity that whatever came next was not going to end with him simply walking away. The 2 men reached the edge of the crowd before Damian made his decision. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the weapon holstered beneath his jacket, though the instinct was there, old and familiar. He simply stepped forward, Ben's hand gripped tightly in his own, and positioned himself directly in their path with the unhurried, absolute stillness of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Gentlemen," Damian said, "this isn't the place." The taller of the 2 men slowed, his eyes moving over Damian with the fast, assessing calculation of someone recalibrating a situation that had suddenly become more complicated than expected. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Damian said. "The boy's with me." Something flickered across the man's face. Not fear exactly, but the particular wariness of a low-level operator suddenly uncertain whether he'd wandered into territory above his authorization to handle. "You don't know who sent us." "I don't need to," Damian said. "Walk away and tell whoever you work for that Damian Cross said the debt on Benjamin Ortiz's aunt is settled, effective today." If anyone comes near this family again, they'll be dealing with me directly, not a phone call. The name landed exactly the way Damian expected it to. The two men exchanged a fast, uncertain look, and within a minute, the black sedan was pulling away from the cemetery gate without another word spoken. Ben did not let go of Damian's hand until the car had disappeared around the corner. "You know them," he said quietly, once the danger had passed. "The men who work for the lone guy." "I know of the operation," Damian said carefully. "I didn't know it had reached your family until about 90 seconds ago." Ben had found them a few minutes later, emerging from the funeral home with red, swollen eyes, stopping short at the sight of her nephew standing beside a stranger in an expensive coat. "Ben," she said, alarm sharpening her voice. "What's going on? Who is this?" "He helped me," Ben said simply. "The bad men were here. He made them leave." Damian introduced himself briefly, watched the woman's face cycle through confusion, fear, and finally a raw, exhausted relief that told him everything about the last several weeks of her life. Her name was Marisol, Ben's mother's younger sister, and the story came out in fragments over the following 20 minutes. Standing near the cemetery fence while mourners filtered past, Ben's mother had died 8 months earlier, an illness that had eaten through whatever modest savings the family had, and Marisol, unmarried, working 2 jobs, had taken in her sister's son without a second thought, and without any real understanding of what it would cost her. The loan had started small, a few $1,000s to cover funeral costs and back rent, borrowed from a man who'd been recommended by a coworker as someone who helped people in a pinch. Within 4 months, the interest had ballooned the debt past anything Marisol could realistically repay. And the calls had turned into visits, and the visits had turned, 3 weeks ago, into a clear and specific threat: pay in full within 30 days, or the debt would be settled a different way, through the boy instead of the money. "I didn't know what else to do," Marisol said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't leave him alone at the apartment. I couldn't afford a sitter. I brought him everywhere with me, because I was terrified the one time I left him somewhere. She couldn't finish the sentence. Damian looked down at Ben, standing close against his aunt's side now, watching this conversation with the same wide, careful attention he'd shown at the cemetery gate, a child who had learned, far too young, exactly how precarious safety could be. "I can help," Damian said, "not as charity, as something owed. The man running that loan operation, I have history with him that has nothing to do with either of you, and everything to do with a debt that's been sitting unpaid for a very long time." Marisol frowned. "What debt?" Damian was quiet a moment, turning something over that he hadn't spoken aloud in 17 years. "The man who sent those 2 men today," he said slowly, "goes by Victor Reyes now. 17 years ago, he went by a different name, and he was responsible for something that took someone very important from my own family. I've been looking for a way to finally close that chapter for a long time. I didn't expect it to arrive at a cemetery attached to an 8-year-old boy who has nothing to do with any of it." Ben looked up at him, something careful and curious moving behind his tired eyes. "What did he do to your family?" Ben asked, with the blunt directness only children manage. Damian looked at this small boy who had asked a stranger to pretend an embrace was real, simply to survive one more day, and felt the old wound in his chest crack open a little further, preparing, for the first time in 17 years, to finally be examined in the light. "He killed my younger brother," Damian said quietly. "And until about 10 minutes ago, I thought the men responsible had all disappeared without a trace." Marcus arrived at Ravenwood within the hour, summoned by a single phone call that had carried none of Damian's usual measured calm. "Victor Reyes," Damian said, the moment Marcus stepped into the study. "I need everything. Every alias, every property, every operation he's touched in the last 5 years. And I need it cross-referenced against a case file from 17 years ago, the Alessandro Cross case. My brother's death." Marcus's expression shifted, careful and grim, the way it always did when Damian mentioned Alessandro, a name spoken so rarely in this house that even the household staff had learned years ago not to ask. "I thought that case went cold," Marcus said. "The man who ordered the hit disappeared. We tracked him as far as the Mexican border and lost him entirely." "He didn't disappear," Damian said. "He rebuilt himself under a new name and started over 3 states away, running exactly the same kind of operation that killed my brother in the first place. Predatory debt. Families squeezed until they had nothing left to give but a child. It took Marcus's team 6 hours to build the full picture, and by midnight, the folder on Damian's desk told a story considerably larger than one predatory loan shark preying on a grieving ant. Victor Reyes, born Victor Salgado, the name buried under 2 decades of careful reconstruction, had spent the years since Alessandro's death building a network across 4 states, each operation structured identically. Small loans offered to desperate families during moments of crisis, interest rates calibrated specifically to guarantee default, and a final settlement mechanism that had nothing to do with money at all. "He's been taking children," Marcus said quietly, sliding a second folder across the desk. "For at least 6 years, based on what we've traced. Not for ransom. For a separate operation entirely, placement, sold through falsified adoption paperwork to families who never ask too many questions about where a child actually came from." Damian's hands went very still on the desk. "You're telling me Ben would have disappeared into an illegal adoption pipeline if I hadn't been standing in that cemetery?" "I'm telling you," Marcus said, "that we found records of at least 11 other children processed through this exact scheme in the last 2 years alone. 17 years ago, your brother uncovered an early version of this same operation. That's why Reyes had him killed, boss. Alessandro wasn't collateral damage in some unrelated dispute. He found out what Reyes was really doing, and he was building a case to expose it." The room went very quiet. Damian sat back slowly, the entire shape of the last 17 years reorganizing itself around a truth he'd never once considered. That his brother's death hadn't been a random act of underworld violence, but the deliberate silencing of a man who'd stumbled onto exactly the kind of horror now standing, unfinished, at Damian's own door. "Where is Reyes now?" Damian said. "Warehouse District, North Side," Marcus said. "He operates out of a legitimate-looking finance office during the day. But we've confirmed a secondary location, a processing facility where the children are held before placement. We don't have an exact address yet, but we're close." "How close?" "Days, maybe. Not hours." Marcus hesitated. "Boss, there's something else. Reyes's men who backed off at the cemetery today, they'll have reported that name back to him by now. Damian Cross, showing up out of nowhere, invoking a debt from 17 years ago. If Reyes has any memory of what happened to your brother, he's going to understand immediately who he's dealing with." "Good," Damian said. "Let him be afraid. A frightened man makes mistakes. Or a frightened man accelerates his timeline," Marcus said carefully. "If he thinks you're closing in on the placement operation, he may decide to move every child currently in that facility immediately, before we ever find the location. Faster processing. Faster disappearance. We could lose every one of them in a single night." Damian looked down at the folder. 11 names, 11 children, 11 families who had trusted a smiling man's promise of easy money and paid for it with something no amount of money could ever repay. He thought of Ben, asleep down the hall in one of the estate's guest rooms, having finally, for the first time in weeks, let his aunt tuck him into a bed without watching the door the entire time. "Find that facility," Damian said quietly. "Whatever it takes. Because if Reyes moves those children before we get there, we don't just lose a case 17 years old. We lose 11 more families exactly like the one that lost my brother." He did not yet know that Ben, unable to sleep in an unfamiliar house despite the safety of it, had slipped out of his guest room and was standing quietly in the study doorway, having heard every word of the last 5 minutes, and that the boy was about to tell him something that would change the entire shape of tomorrow's plan. "I know where it is." Damian and Marcus both turned at once. Ben stood in the doorway in borrowed pajamas 2 sizes too large, his bare feet silent on the study's hardwood floor. His eyes wide but steady in a way that told Damian this was not a child stumbling into a conversation he didn't understand. "Ben," Damian said carefully, "how long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," Ben said. "I know where the bad men take kids. I almost went there. 3 weeks ago, before my aunt got the money together the first time. They put me in a van and drove me somewhere, and then Aunt Marisol called them crying, saying she had a payment, and they turned around and took me back home." His hands twisted together in front of him. "But I saw the building before we turned around. It had a blue door, and a sign that used to say something, but most of the letters had fallen off. It just said Orage now, because the ST went missing." Marcus was already pulling up a map on his tablet. "Storage." "A storage facility with a partial sign that narrows the warehouse district considerably. Can you remember anything else?" Street signs, landmarks, how long the drive took. Ben thought hard, his small face scrunched with the effort of pulling apart a memory he'd clearly spent weeks trying to forget rather than examine. There was a bridge. We went under it right before we got there. And there was a dog barking somewhere close, really loud, the whole time we were driving up. At Junkyard, Marcus said slowly. There's a scrapyard 2 blocks from the old rail bridge on the north side. Guard dogs on the property line. It backs onto a row of storage units that went out of business 18 months ago. He looked up at Damian. That's it. That has to be it. Damian crossed the room and crouched down in front of Ben, the same way he had at the cemetery gate that afternoon, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. You just helped save 11 children, he said quietly. Do you understand that? What you just told us, it might be the only reason we find that place before it's too late. Ben looked at him for a long moment, something old and tired moving behind his 8-year-old eyes. I kept thinking about the other kids there, he said. When I was in the van, I didn't see them, but I could hear them. Crying, some of them. I kept thinking, what if nobody ever comes back for them the way my aunt came back for me? Damian's throat tightened in a way he hadn't experienced in longer than he could measure. Somebody's coming for them, he said. Tonight, if we move fast enough. The strike was organized within 2 hours, Marcus's team confirming the location through aerial surveillance. Damian personally reviewing every detail of the approach with the same focused precision he'd once brought to negotiations worth millions. Except tonight the stakes carried a weight no amount of money had ever matched. They moved just past 3 in the morning, when the facility's night shift had thinned to its minimum coverage. 4 armed men positioned around the perimeter, easily overwhelmed by Marcus's team of 12. The confrontation ending in under 90 seconds with no shots fired onto their side. The element of surprise doing the work violence would otherwise have required. Inside, in a row of converted storage units retrofitted with cots and thin blankets, they found 9 children, ages ranging from 4 to 12, frightened and confused but alive, unharmed, waiting in the dark for something none of them had understood was coming. 2 units were empty. They already moved 2 of them, Marcus said grimly, checking a logbook left carelessly on a folding table near the entrance. 3 days ago. Transfer notation here says placement complete. No destination listed. Damian felt something cold and absolute settle into his chest. Reyes. He's not here, Marcus confirmed. Neither are the 2 children already placed. Boss, if he's already moved them into families, finding them again could take weeks. Months. The paperwork's designed specifically to be untraceable. Damian looked at the 9 frightened children being gently gathered by Marcus's team, wrapped in blankets. Spoken to in the same quiet, careful tones Damian himself had used with Ben that afternoon. 9 families about to be reunited, and 2 more still lost somewhere in a system built entirely to make sure they were never found. Then we don't stop at 9, Damian said. We find Reyes himself tonight, before he has a chance to disappear the way he did 17 years ago. Because I am not walking away from this the same way I walked away from my brother's case. Not again. Victor Reyes was not at his finance office when Damian's men arrived at dawn, nor at the modest house registered under his current alias, nor at any of the 3 other properties Marcus's team had confirmed in the last 12 hours. He was, Damian understood with a cold certainty, already running, exactly as he had run 17 years ago. The moment he sensed the ground shifting beneath an operation he'd spent years building. He'll try the border again, Marcus said, standing over a map spread across Damian's desk. Red pins marking every property, every known associate, every route Reyes had used to vanish the first time. Same pattern as before. If he makes it across, boss, we lose him a second time, and this time he'll rebuild somewhere we may never find at all. Not this time, Damian said. He had spent 17 years believing his brother's death was a debt he'd never get to collect. He was not going to let that debt slip through his fingers a second time over a border crossing and a fresh set of papers. They found him 6 hours later, at a private airstrip 40 miles outside the city, boarding a small chartered plane with 2 suitcases and considerably less composure than the man who had once run 4 states' worth of operations with careful, patient confidence. Damian walked across the tarmac alone, Marcus's men positioned at a distance, weapons ready but holstered, because Damian understood, standing there in the cold morning wind, that this confrontation required something other than violence to actually matter. Victor, Damian said, or should I still call you Salgado? Reyes went very still at the base of the airplane stairs, the color draining slowly from his face as recognition arrived in full. Damian Cross, he said quietly. 17 years, and you still look exactly like your brother. You remember him then? I remember exactly what he cost me, Reyes said, something bitter and unrepentant moving into his voice. He was going to destroy everything I'd built. I did what I had to do to protect it. You killed a 23-year-old man for finding out you were selling children, Damian said, his voice carrying none of the heat the words deserved, only a flat, absolute certainty. And then you spent 17 years building the exact same operation, bigger, in a different city, under a different name. It's a business, Reyes said. Desperate people need money. Some of them have nothing left to offer, but… Don't finish that sentence, Damian said, and something in his voice made even Marcus, 30 feet away, go still. I have 9 children in protective custody right now who will spend years in therapy because of what you built. I have 2 more who are still missing, sold into homes that have no idea what they actually paid for. And I have an 8-year-old boy who asked a stranger at his mother's funeral to pretend a hug was real, because he understood, better than most adults ever will, exactly what you and men like you are capable of doing to a family with nothing left to protect itself. Reyes's composure cracked, fear finally breaking through the careful mask he'd worn for 17 years. What do you want, Cross? Money? I'll pay whatever you… I want the 2 children you sold 3 days ago, Damian said. Names, addresses, every piece of falsified paperwork tied to their placement. I want a full confession, recorded, detailed enough to survive any court that tries this case. And I want you to understand, clearly, that the only reason you're walking off this tarmac alive is because killing you would be easier than making you actually answer for what you've done. It took considerably less than the 6 hours Marcus had estimated. Reyes, facing federal charges that would follow him regardless of which country he fled to, and facing a version of Damian Cross considerably more dangerous than anything money could outmaneuver, gave up everything within the hour, names, addresses, the full architecture of an operation 17 years in the building. The 2 missing children were recovered within 3 days, returned to families who had genuinely believed, in both cases, they were adopting legitimately, unaware entirely of the horror underlying the paperwork they trusted. Victor Reyes was handed to federal authorities that same afternoon, the case against him built on evidence solid enough to end not just this operation, but 3 others across 2 states that had, for years, operated on the exact same model. Damian stood on the airstrip long after Reyes had been taken away, the cold wind cutting through his coat, and felt something in his chest finally, after 17 years, settle into something that wasn't quite peace, but was close enough to feel like the beginning of it. He thought of Alessandro, 23 years old and furious about an injustice he'd refused to look away from, and understood, standing there, that his brother's death had not been meaningless after all, that the case he died trying to build had finally, 17 years later, been finished. He thought of Ben, waiting back at Ravenwood, asleep for the first time in weeks without watching the door. It's done, Marcus said quietly, coming to stand beside him. All of it, boss. Every child accounted for. Every piece of the operation dismantled. Damian nodded slowly, watching the small chartered plane sit empty and abandoned on the tarmac, its intended passenger already in federal custody. Not quite everything, he said. There's still one more thing I need to figure out. What's that? Damian looked back toward the car, toward the city, toward the small house where Ben and Marisol were waiting to hear whether the danger that had followed them for months was finally, truly over. What happens now? He said quietly, for a boy who's spent his whole short life learning that safety is something you have to pretend at. Just to survive one more day. 3 months passed, and the quiet that settled over Ravenwood in that time felt, to Damian, less like the empty silence he'd lived inside for 17 years and more like the particular stillness of a house finally, slowly, learning how to breathe again. Ben and Marisol had moved into the estate's east guest house in the weeks following Reyes's arrest, not as a permanent arrangement at first, simply as the safest option while the federal case against Reyes's remaining associates worked its way through the courts. Marisol had resisted. The same careful pride Damian had come to recognize in people who'd spent too long surviving entirely on their own, until the practical reality of court dates and press attention and lingering fear made the guesthouse impossible to refuse any longer. Somewhere in those 3 months, without either of them fully deciding it, the arrangement had stopped feeling temporary. Ben started at a new school in September, one close enough to Ravenwood that Damian's driver could bring him home each afternoon. And within the first month, his teacher sent home a note that made Damian read it twice at his study desk. Something unfamiliar and warm moving through his chest at the words. Ben is a bright, thoughtful boy. He mentioned today that his Uncle Damian taught him to play chess. I wanted to let you know how much he lights up talking about him. Damian had never once corrected anyone who used that title. He found somewhere in the last 3 months that he no longer wanted to. On a quiet evening in early October, Damian found Ben in the estate's small library, curled into the window seat with a book he wasn't really reading, staring instead at the darkening garden outside. "Everything all right?" Damian asked, settling into the chair across from him. Ben was quiet a moment. "I had a bad dream last night. About the van. The one that took me." Damian's chest tightened. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not really," Ben said. "But I wanted you to know it happened. Aunt Marisol says it's okay to still have the bad dreams sometimes, even when things are good now." "She's right," Damian said. "It takes time. More time than anyone wants it to take. But it does get easier." Ben studied him for a long moment, the same careful, assessing look he'd given Damian at the cemetery gate months earlier, though it carried none of the fear now. "Can I ask you something?" Ben said. "Anything." "That day at the cemetery," Ben said slowly, "when I asked you to pretend you were hugging me, were you actually pretending? Or did you mean it, even a little, even though you didn't know me yet?" Damian was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over with the same care he gave every decision that had ever mattered in his life. "I think," he said finally, "some part of me meant it before I understood why. I'd spent 17 years keeping people at a distance, Ben. I'd built a very good wall around whatever was left of me after I lost my brother. And then a boy I'd never met asked me to pretend to care about him for 1 minute, just to survive an afternoon. And something about that broke straight through everything I thought I'd built." Ben considered this seriously, the way he considered most things now, with a thoughtfulness that no longer carried the exhausted wariness of those first weeks. "I don't think I need to pretend anymore," he said quietly. "Do you think, would it be okay if I just ask for a real one sometimes? Not because something bad is happening. Just because." Damian felt something in his chest, sealed for 17 years and cracked wide open in a cemetery 3 months earlier, finally give way entirely. "Come here," he said, and Ben crossed the small distance between them and let himself be pulled into an embrace that neither of them needed to perform. Warm and unhurried and entirely, simply real. 6 months later, on a bright spring afternoon, the adoption papers were finalized in a quiet courtroom downtown, not replacing Marisol, who remained exactly what she had always been, Ben's family by blood and by choice, but adding Damian's name alongside hers, legal and permanent, the kind of family built not by accident but by two people who had chosen, deliberately, to become one for a boy who deserved every version of safety the world could offer him. That evening, back at Ravenwood, Ben ran across the wide lawn as the sun began to set, Marisol laughing as she watched from the porch, and found Damian standing near the old oak tree at the garden's edge. "Uncle Damian," Ben called, though the word Damian noticed had started sounding less like a title and more like something else entirely in recent weeks. "Can I have a hug?" "A real one. Just because." Damian knelt down and opened his arms, and Ben ran straight into them without a moment's hesitation. No performance, no pretending, no fear hiding beneath the gesture at all. Some families are built by blood. Others are built in the space of a single desperate afternoon, when a frightened boy asks a stranger to pretend, and the stranger, without fully understanding why, decides that pretending was never going to be enough. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more emotional Mafia stories, and share it with someone who believes family is something you choose, not just something you're born into. Do you think Damian would have stopped to help Ben if his own brother's story hadn't been connected to it?